So we are continuing with the final week, and we are looking at Holy Monday. So let's begin with a word of prayer. Most gracious and loving God, we truly give you thanks as we come together once again for this evening and continuing in our study, and as we look at the final week of Jesus' earthly life. We pray that your Spirit will guide us, and as we engage in Scripture, may your Spirit open up our hearts and our minds to engage in the Scripture and the story, and to glean from it, oh God, insights that help us grow in our faith. Lord, we pray for your blessing upon us. We are mindful of those who are not with us and usually with us. Just be with us, oh God, especially through this Lenten season. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Last week, we kind of covered, we covered Palm Sunday. And if you remember, we sort of left off after the triumphant entry into Jerusalem. We left off right before getting into the next set of stories, which is the cleansing of the temple, according to some gospels. So I don't know if you can read that. I tried to quickly make a chart. This was what I was doing this afternoon. So if you kind of read the stories in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not every story is in all the Gospels. You guys know that, right? Very rarely is any story in all four Gospels. What we normally have is a compilation of stories from all the Gospels, but each Gospel tells a very specific story, and because of that, there are some stories that's taken out, some stories added in, some stories that are rearranged in different sequence. In terms of the Gospel timeline, you just kind of looking at it, wow. You're going to notice a couple of things that's sort of repeated and all over the place. So for example, we know that on Sunday, or as we covered last week, Jesus journeyed from the Sea of Galilee, which is up north, northern Israel, down to Jerusalem, which is about 80 miles. So that takes a couple months to kind of, well, if you do a sprint, I guess you could do it in like 10 days or 12 days of constant walking. But usually, with Jesus teaching and, stopping by here and there, you would kind of guess it took probably about a month to travel down. On Palm Sunday, the Sunday, our understanding is that, we kind of assume that he spent most of Sunday traveling from Jericho, which is near the Jordan River, all the way across to Jerusalem. That's, well, I'll get to it. That's about 25 miles. And so so on Sunday morning, let's say, again, during those days, they would travel starting from early in the morning, and he would travel from Jericho to Jerusalem. According to the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, the triumphant entry happened sometime during the day. If you're like me, because we're so used to having Palm Sunday celebration on Sunday morning, I always thought, it must have been a morning event, right? Bright in the morning, everyone's out and everyone's celebrating and everyone's waving their palms and Jesus is coming in. Well, as you'll see in a bit, that's highly unlikely because he would have had to walk from Jericho to Jerusalem. But according to Matthew and Luke, it has to happen sometime in the morning because according to Matthew and Luke, he went from the triumphant entry directly to cleansing of the temple. And then, after making a ruckus, he left, went out of Jerusalem, stayed in Bethany, and then came back to the temple the next day. Hi, Nancy. Welcome. He's coming. I was going to say, is Dawn here? Or did he take a shower? No. So according to Matthew and Luke, the cleansing of the temple happened on Sunday afternoon. Mark, on the other hand, has a very clear, and we're going to read according to Mark, it says the next morning. The next morning, or it actually says after coming into Jerusalem, he kind of checks things out and then he leaves right away. And then it's the next morning that he comes in and cleanses the temple. The Gospel of John, well, we'll actually see it in a bit, or the next one right here. According to the Gospel of John, the cleansing of the temple happens on John chapter 2. That's not during the last week of Jesus' life. That happened at the very beginning, right after the wedding at Cana. So what does this mean? What is this, okay. What this says is that not all the Gospels have the chronology correct, or was it meant to be chronological? We know that when we read the Gospel of John, John had a very specific message that he wanted to tell through the Gospel, and that was that Jesus is the Son of God. And it didn't matter for him to kind of have the events exactly in order. Luke, it does say in the first 4 verses of the Gospel of Luke that he tried to give an orderly account. And so Luke and Matthew kind of are similar in that timeline, that it's happened on Sunday right after coming into Jerusalem. But there's a little challenge to that story, which I will share in a bit. And Mark is the earliest of the Gospels. And according to Mark, like I said, it happens on the next day. So in the end, it really doesn't matter, right? But again, each of the Gospel writers are trying to not only tell a story, but there's a message behind it. And I think for looking at the story behind why Mark put it on Monday, it makes a little bit more sense. So since we were done with Palm Sunday last week, we're moving into Monday.
Can I just ask you a quick question?
Yeah.
This last week when you talked about the triumphant entry into Jerusalem, that going in one gate, coming out the other, then you talked about going up to the Mount of Olives.
Yes.
So where does that come in?
That's one of the problems. I'm so glad you caught that, Valerie. Yes, so again, the triumphant entry, okay, those are the verses. So Jesus comes in, right? And there's all this waving. And again, because we know that he had to travel, again, this is the general map of Israel that I showed last week. And Jesus traveled from, and the disciples traveled from up north by the Sea of Galilee, which is up there, traveled down along the Jordan River, and then cut across from Jericho, which is right at the tip of the Jordan River, across to Jerusalem. That journey, okay, and this is a sort of like a satellite picture-ish, is not a smooth road. It's 25 miles. We know that because it's still there, right? And it's through mountainous region. And if you remember, one of the stories that Jesus tells about what kind of a road is between Jerusalem and Jericho, there's a very famous parable that he tells about a man who travels from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and while he's traveling, what happens? He's robbed, right? Remember, he's attacked by bandits, right? Who would hide along the caverns. Well, you can see, according to this sort of like a graphic picture of the terrain, the roads are windy, and bandits would hide out to ambush travelers. What that also means is that you wouldn't be traveling this during night. You would travel during the day to be safe. And so from Jericho over, again, 25 miles, it takes about, oh gosh, how long does it take to walk 25 miles?
The missions were spaced about 20 miles apart, because that's when the priests figured people could make 20 miles a day. 5 miles means more than one day.
Right, right?
Especially if you're climbing mountains.
Exactly. So at the best rate, like you are, in good health and you're chugging along, it's going to take about 8-10 hours, if not a good 12-hour walk. And assuming, back in those days, they're not as, dependent on cars or sluggish as we are. They're used to walking a lot.
But they're wearing sandals.
They're wearing sandals. Typically, what they would do is they would, as soon as daybreak, they would start traveling, right? And so let's say they got up at 6 and they started walking at 6 o'clock, and 10, 12 hours of walking. By the time you get to Jerusalem, it's not morning. It's not early afternoon. It's late, right? You're tired. Maybe that's why Jesus really needed that donkey after all, right? So because of that, by the time they get to into Jerusalem, again, according to Matthew and Luke, it says that Jesus came into Jerusalem, and even coming into Jerusalem, he didn't just come directly in. Remember, he sent out a couple disciples to go get a colt, right, or go get the donkey, come back. So that takes a couple more hours, right? So because of that sequence, it's unlikely that Jesus would have gone straight into the temple and then created a ruckus, right? Plus, of course, as Valerie pointed out, according to the Gospel of Luke, he went back out and he wept over Jerusalem. And why was he weeping over Jerusalem? Because he knew that the type of Messiah that the people in Jerusalem, the people that were lining the streets, were expecting was a military commander that would, through might, through war or battle, overpower the Roman. And Jesus wept because he knew that violence doesn't lead to peace. Take that story, and it's kind of hard to put this story right next to Jesus, violently cleansing the temple, right? If Jesus went directly to the temple, overthrew or overturned all the tables, and then went up and cried, saying, violence doesn't result in peace, that just doesn't make sense, right? So that's one of the challenges. Now, I could be wrong, but that's one of the things where, sometimes the passages sometimes don't quite line up. The Gospel of Mark kind of deals with that by placing it on the next day. And so, according to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus comes into Jerusalem. The triumphant entry is more towards afternoon or even late afternoon or even in the eve. It can't be evening. It has to be closer to late afternoon. And he goes in and he says, according to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 11, which is triumphant entry, after he comes into Jerusalem, it says, "Then he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple, and when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. What's with Bethany? Bethany is where the Mount of Olives is, just outside of Jerusalem, and that's where it's the home of Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus. They were good friends. So often, that's where Jesus would stay. It's just outside of Jerusalem. And so, according to the Gospel of Mark, he comes into Jerusalem, he goes back out, stays there, and then the next morning, he returns to Jerusalem. And on the way, Mark chapter 11, verses 12 to 14, it says, "On the following day," so Monday, "when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. Seeing at the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not season for figs." Okay, so he sees a tree, doesn't see any figs, or he had hoped to find fruit on it, but it wasn't the season, so he doesn't find any.
But he wouldn't know that.
He should, except something's wrong with this tree. I didn't read the last sentence yet.
No one ever eat.
For it was not in season for figs. So then, instead of just letting it go, he says to it, May no one ever eat fruit from you again. Ooh. And his disciple heard it. It's like, what is wrong with Jesus today? Just having a really bad day, right?
Right.
Well, maybe he was having a bad day. I don't know. So what's going on with this story? Mark is the only one that has this little segment in between the triumphant entry and the cleansing of the temple. And he places this passage because it's setting something up. It is creating a back context, background context to how we are to understand what was going to happen at the temple. So, again, kind of breaking down this story of Jesus goes to a fig tree, and you would think, well, Jesus should know better, right? He's a much better gardener than I am. So, he sees a tree, and he expects to find fruit. Well, why would he expect to find fruit? Because it says that the tree was already in leaf. In other words, it was already blossoming. So it should have been showing fruit. Even though it wasn't in season yet, sometimes trees do that, right? Mm-hmm. On the outside, it looked like it should have fruit. But when he went up to it, it didn't. I remember back in 2003. Do you remember this? It was one of the biggest fires that we had. I know in this region, the Thomas fire was devastating. But when was the Thomas fire? That was 2015. Okay. Was it? Was it only 15? Not too long ago. Yeah. In 2003, I remember this because I was serving a church in Orange County. I was just about to go down to San Diego. And of course, this was the fire that was pretty much had most of Southern California engulfed, right? And one of the big fires, the old fire by Lake Arrowhead, that was the largest one. I think that was the largest mass. And if you remember, all those trees just went up in flames. And do you remember why those trees went up in flames? They were infested by these beetle bugs, right? And that's when they talked about these bark beetles that burrow, small little beetles that burrow straight into the bark and eat the tree from the inside. So from the outside, all these trees, these massive trees, these pine trees, they look fine from the outside, but the inside was all gone. It was all rotten. Remember that? Mm-hmm. And because it was all rotten on the inside, when the fires hit, basically they were just shell, they were just fuel for the flame.
Same thing's happening up by Bass Lake, but they learned and they're chopping them down.
Right. Well, and since then, I know even California, we've been trying to be proactive about these bark beetles. Well, what this, again, why I go back to or tell about this is because it's a perfect analogy of what Jesus saw in that fig tree. That fig tree, it wasn't necessarily dead, but what it showed on the outside was not true of what was on the inside. The fig tree was not in bloom, and yet on the outside appearance, it looked like it was in bloom. It looked like it should bear fruit, when in reality that tree was not bearing fruit. So so think about that. Keep that in mind of how sometimes the outward appearance is not reflective of what is inside. So then Jesus enters Jerusalem. He came to Jerusalem and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers. And when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. Mark is very clear. Jesus came in, he leaves. So that we know that was one full day. So that day, he just did one thing. He came in, he had this fig tree, he cursed the fig tree, he went into the temple, he overturned tables, and he went out. So the story about the money changers and the merchants in the temple. And a lot of times when we hear the story, we get this image of Jesus being very upset and angry, right? Why was he upset? Why is he angry? And a lot of times we think, well, it's because the money changers and the merchants, and we get this image of, well, they're doing business in the temple, and so the business is something that is considered unholy, thing that practices that would defile the holiness of the temple. And so that's typically the image or the story that we kind of think of.
Don't you think it's interesting that the doves were so much a part of that when he let them loose? Because a dove is a symbol of peace.
That is interesting.
Yeah.
What's with the doves, though?
Well, he was selling them. Yeah.
Okay. The doves were for sacrifice. So you have to understand, you have to understand the whole practice of what was going on in the temple at that time, right? Part of the reason why these merchants were there selling doves and other animals, not just the doves, there's other animals, was because it was all part of the sacrificial system. And remember, this is a very special week that it was leading up to. It was the week of Passover. That means people from all over would have been congregating, coming, or what do you call, pilgrimage, right, to Jerusalem for the Passover festivals. And part of that is worship, in which you are to offer sacrifice. And the sacrifice, according to Leviticus, it's very clear. If you, for priests, for anyone who served as priests, and priests, they're not just priests in Jerusalem at the temple, they're priests everywhere, right? Because they would also lead synagogues and so forth. Well, these priests, according to Leviticus, a sin offering for a priest has to be a bull. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't think they carry bulls in their pockets, right? So if they're traveling from afar, they're not going to be carrying a bull with them. For regular people, for ordinary people, it's a goat or a sheep. A sin offering is a goat or a sheep. And for poor people, there is a provision, because not everyone can afford a sheep or a goat. For poor people, it's 2 turtle doves. 2 turtle doves. Does that remind you of a song?
Yes, it does.
The 12 days of Christmas. The 12 days of Christmas is actually, all the 12 symbols actually represents certain devotions in the gospel, right? The 12 is the 12 apostles. 11 are 12 apostles are the 12 tribes. 11 are the 11 faithful disciples that didn't betray Jesus. 10 something, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And 2 turtle doves and a partridge in a pear tree. The partridge in a pear tree is actually representing Jesus Christ. So anyhow, so this is according to the book of Leviticus. These are the ascribed animals that you would need for the sacrifices at the temple. Unfortunately, again, practical reasons, when people are traveling from afar, and especially if you think about even Jesus would not be able to bring a sheep or a goat from the Sea of Galilee, right? Not that he needed one, but anyone else, they wouldn't be able to. And so what would they normally do? They would come to Jerusalem, and they would either bring money, and they would have to exchange that money. Plus, they couldn't just use any money, right? Because, again, most of the money that they used at that time, the Roman coins had a certain face on it, right? And it was usually whoever was the emperor at the time, and on the back of the coin, around the edges, it would always say something like Caesar divine or something of that sort, basically indicating that the emperor is God. And so that in itself was considered, you can't use that in the temple. And so the money changers would exchange the Roman coins to temple coins, and you can see the temple coins did not have those depictions. The temple coins had things like a chalice and a wheat. That actually looks like temple coins after Jesus that the Christians would have used. But the temple coins back then did not have any face, a person on it. So in that sense, much of the activity in the temple are actually legitimate practices, right? Exchanging of money, selling of the animals, those are legitimate practices. So if they were legitimate practices, why would Jesus be upset?
Why were they in the temple instead of outside?
Why are they in the temple instead of outside? Well, the temple, and
They are in the outside. 'Cause
the temple, well, I'm glad you asked that. Because the temple has multiple areas. As you can see in this picture, there is the outside and there's a wall, right? There are different, areas, regions. On that picture, the outside the main temple area is what we call the court of the Gentiles. Anyone can gather there, not just Jews, anyone. But once you go into this inner court or within the walls of the temple, only Jews can enter. This first part there's two levels. All the way on the outside, it's the Gentiles. This upper level, there's like several steps up. You're always ascending up to the temple. This outer area is what you call the women's court. So all the Jews, men and women, can gather up to this upper level, and then inside the wall are only men. Sorry, it was just this. It was just the times. And then once you go inside that barrier right there, only the priest could go in. And in that high portion is where the curtain is, between the holy and the holy. And only the high priest can enter into that big monument only once a year, on Yom Kippur. And he would go in only once a year to offer a sacrifice. He would always take in 2 bulls. One bull for himself. He would always sacrifice a bull to ask for forgiveness for his sins or impurity, whatever. And then he would sacrifice the second bull for the nation of Israel or the people of Israel. But he always do that first. And it's very interesting, the whole practice. I don't know if you've heard that when they go in, they usually tie a rope around the high priest with a bell. And there's always a bell so that as the priest is praying and moving around, that bell would always sound. Because the people on the outside cannot look in, but they can hear the priest moving. If that bell ever stopped, because why would the bell stop? Apparently, that bull didn't do the job. And so that means the sacrifice was not sufficed, or he was not the bull, right? Basically, he was zapped or something. So the whole idea was he would go in with a rope, with a bell, and if that bell ever stopped, that means something went wrong, and that would have to pull him back out because they can't go in. And so the next person in line becomes the high priest. But that's how the temple works, right? So again, the whole, again, the practice of what was going on is that the merchants and the money changer would be on the outside, right? On the either in the women's court or on the Gentile court, because that's where the exchange could happen. They're not in the primary walls of the temple. Let me go over a little history about the temple. The temple has always been a problem. The temple has always been a stumbling block for Israel. And if you remember the story of how the temple came about, the temple is such a big part of Israel's history and a big part of the conflict that was going on in the time of Jesus. But you have to understand in the context that the temple has always been an issue. God never wanted the temple, right? Remember? The Israelites worship, they worshiped the temple, unfortunately, and that was the problem. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, we have the story of King David, after building his house, felt so bad that he saw that the Ark of the Covenant was housed in a tent, the tent of tabernacles outside, and call it guilt. But he prayed to God saying, can I build your house? And God's response to David was, no, I don't want a house. Why? Because once you build a house with a foundation, what happens to the house? It's put, right? It stays put. Whereas the tabernacle was something that God instructed Moses and the people of Israel during the time of the wilderness, right? When they were traveling from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land, God led the people of Israel by the cloud, the pillar of fire during the day, and the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, so they could see. And whenever that cloud would stop and rest on the Ark of the Covenant, they pitched a tent around it, and everyone just kind of gathered together. When that cloud lifted up and started to move, the people gathered up their thing and they followed. So the people followed God's leading. Once the Ark of the Covenant was placed in the temple, the Ark was not to be moved. And who started dictating who had access to God? The priest, the people, and the king. Right? So David proposed to build a temple, and God said no. Ultimately, Solomon. David still drew up all the legal plans and the instructions, and Solomon ends up building the temple in 957 BC. It took 7 years to build the temple, King Solomon. And if you remember King Solomon, he was probably the wealthiest, and the kingdom of Israel was at its height at that time under King Solomon. And it took 7 years to build the temple. It took 13 years to build his own house. Kind of think about that. It took 7 years to build the temple. That temple gets destroyed in 586 BC when the Babylonians come and destroys. When the Babylonians conquer Israel and Judah, and take the Israelites into captivity, that first temple is destroyed in 586 BC. In 539 BC, the Persian Empire defeats the Babylonian Empire, and King Cyrus of Persia tells the Israelites, you can go back to your homeland and rebuild the temple. And so one of the priests, by the name of Zerubbabel, leads one of the bands of people back with Ezra and Nehemiah to Jerusalem, and begins rebuilding of the temple in 539 BC. It took 2 years. Exactly. If it only took 2 years to build a temple that took 7 years when they had all the materials, what does that say about the temple that they built? Not as magnificent. It was very, very crude. It was very, pretty much, Habitat for Humanity, right? All we need is a roof and walls.
Right.
Keep it simple, because all it was for worship, it wasn't meant to be magnificent. Between 586 to 539, again, yes, time goes backwards before Christ. It's only about 50-ish years, right? 40-something years. That's not a long time. I mean, it's a lifespan for some people, but there were Israelites who was alive, who remembered the old temple, Solomon's temple, before it was destroyed. And when it says, it talks about in some of the writings in Psalms, when they saw the new temple, the Zerubbabel's temple, they cried. They cried because they remembered the magnificence of the old temple. That temple does not get destroyed, but in 19 BC, King Herod renovates. Capital campaign, and he renovates the third temple. Okay? This temple took 46 years. So they tried to bring it back up to its magnificence. Now, granted, it was not as grand as the Solomon's temple, because during, again, Solomon's time, Israel was the height of its empire. During Herod's time, they're under Roman rule, right? So they were limited in their materials. So it took 46 years. If you do the math, it's about 27, 28 AD. It's only a couple years before Jesus starts his ministry. So by the time when Jesus is going around with his disciples, and the disciples are like, "Oh, what magnificent is this temple?" It's because it's brand new. It's only been like 2-3 years old since it's been finished, right? So you kind of have to understand the context of what's going on in their minds. But we all know what happened to this temple, right? In 70 AD. It's only 40 years later, it gets ransacked and it's destroyed and it's never rebuilt again. And this temple, nothing remains except the Western Wall. And the Western Wall, right here, was, it's been said that the Romans left a piece of that Western Wall intact as a reminder. Because if they demolish everything, there's no proof. Right? It's that military tactic. You always allow for one survivor to go back and tell the story of what the opposing enemy has done, right? They left the Western Wall intact to show that there was this magnificent walled city, this walled temple that was destroyed. That Western Wall is a symbol now, of course, where all the Jews go and gather and pray. When they pray against the wall, you can see in the pictures, there's prayers that people put into the crevices. How many of you have traveled to Israel and been to the? Really? We gotta go on a field trip.
I don't think so. Like that. I do not think that's the place to go.
Well, yeah, it is a spiritual moment.
Yes, I'm sure it is.
So as you know, right now on the Temple Mount, what stands on the Temple Mount, right? Like the Jerusalem temple, the Israelites temple was never rebuilt after that, and Jerusalem has been a place of constant war, right? Constant war, and especially of the different religions, primarily the 3 Abrahamic religions, which is really odd, sad, because we're brothers and sisters. We're the 3 Abrahamic. We branch from Abraham, and yet we're always conflict. And right now, on top of where the Temple Mount, where the temple used to be, is the Dome of the Rock, right? Why is that place so, why is that the place of so many battles? Do you know why? According to, legend or the beliefs of the Muslims and the Jews, the foundation of where the temple stands is what is known as the creation rock. What is the creation rock? The creation rock is understood, the faith of the Israelites and the Muslims is that the creation rock was the place of when Abraham sacrificed or tried to sacrifice Isaac. It is also the first stone that God created when God created the rest of the world. So that's the belief. And because of that belief, that they believe that that is the holiest of sites. That is why Jerusalem is considered the holiest of cities. And that's why everyone wants control over that. And now you have the issue with human sin, right? Wanting control over God, which is the very thing about the temple. Again, the problem with the temple is that once the temple was built, it was all about whoever had control. Well, building the temple was a way to control God. No wonder it kept getting destroyed. So going back to the story of when Jesus overturns the tables of the temple, it's not just because there are money changers and merchants on the temple grounds. He references, the words that Jesus speaks is actually, he's quoting. He says, is it not written? And it's taken from Jeremiah 7. Jeremiah 7 says this, the word that came to Jeremiah from the Lord, stand in the gate of the Lord's house and proclaim there this word, and say, hear the word of the Lord, all you people of Judah, you that enter these gates to worship the Lord, thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, amend your ways and your doings, and let me dwell with you in this place. Do not trust in these deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. For if you truly amend your ways and your doings, if you truly act justly one with another, if you do not oppress the alien, the orphan, and the widow, or shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not go after other gods to your own hurt, then I will dwell with you in this place, in the land that I gave of old to your ancestors forever and ever. Here you are, trusting in deceptive words to no avail. Will you steal, murder, commit adultery, swear falsely, make offerings to Baal, and go after other gods that you have not known, and then come and stand before me in this house, which is called by my name, and say, we are safe, only to go on doing all these abominations? Has this house, which is called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight? You know, I too am watching, says the Lord. Da-da-da-dung. Those are powerful words, right? That's from Jeremiah during the time of the prophets, of course. And that is what Jesus is referencing. When he calls that, when Jesus is saying to the people, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers. That den of robbers, he's not referring to the merchants or the money changers being the robbers doing their maybe, yes, sure, maybe some were kind of overcharging and being a little deceptive here and there, but that's not what Jesus is talking about when he's talking about the den of robbers. He's talking about those who come to the temple, make their sacrifices, and put on a show thinking, I am holy, I'm a devout Jew, I'm a devout Christian, well, not Christian at that time, but I'm a devout person, even though they're hiding the fact that everything else that they do, their deceptive ways, they lie, cheat, lie, and steal, and pretend that they are all clean on the outside. It's all about the outside appearance versus the inside core.
And that's the fig tree.
and thus the fig tree. You see how Mark just kind of weaved it right in there? So his message is about, when he's talking about the den of robbers, he's talking directly to unfortunately, the religious leaders at that time who were pretending that they knew it all, that they're the holy ones, praying long prayers outside and saying, well, thank you, God, that I'm not like that sinner. And Jesus is speaking to them saying, don't make this into a den of thieves. A den of thieves is not a place where thieves do their robbing work. A den is a place where they hide out. So these religious leaders are hiding out in the temple, thinking that they are safe, right? They are safe. That's what Jeremiah said. That is the message. That is what Jesus is talking about. And so, after Jesus said this, verse 18 says, when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him. That's why they wanted to kill him. Because, yes, he basically revealed their inner faults. Now, before it gets bad, let me kind of, again, lead into the next day. In the morning, this is what follows right after. In the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree again. The fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. Jesus answered them, have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone. For that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses. Oh, this kind of ties in with
what you just talked
my sermon this coming Sunday. Anyhow, as we talk about this fig tree, I want to make one more reference, though, before we close. In the Gospel of Luke, there is a parable of the fig tree, and only the Gospel of Luke tells this story. And it's not connected to this story, or it's not connected to the timeline of when Jesus enters Jerusalem for the triumphant entry, because in the Gospel of Luke, that happens in chapter 19. This is long before. This is in chapter 13. There's a story of the parable of the fig tree. In this parable of the fig tree, it says this. Then Jesus told this parable. A man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came looking for fruit on it and found none. So he said to the gardener, see here, for 3 years I have come looking for fruit on this fig tree, and still I find none. Cut it down. Why should it be wasting the soil? And he replied, Sir, let it alone for 1 more year until I dig around it and put manure in it. If it bears fruit next year, well and good. But if not, then you can cut it down. Patience. 1 more chance. 1 more chance. What is Jesus trying to say by this parable? In this parable, Jesus is not the man who comes to the tree and says, looking for the fruit and saying, cut it down. That's not Jesus. It's everyone else that sees and says, well, okay, sure. Maybe it's, I don't know. But it says he came looking for it for 3 years. Maybe it's God, I don't know. Looking for it for 3 years, and it had none. And so the farmer The farmer. Who is the farmer? Usually, who is the farmer in these parables? Right? The farmer says, let's give it one more year, and let's try putting everything into it. And if it grows, great. One more chance. Three things. If you look at Israel's history, when we look at Israel's history, there are 3 times that God intervenes to call upon Israel to return back to God. The first one is known as, is when God called Moses and gave them the laws. The laws were so that it could give the people some guidance, clear instructions. 10 things. Just follow these 10 things. It's not that hard. Well, actually it is, but still, just 10 things, right? And yet they couldn't, right? They expanded the 10 things to 313 and made it even harder. So then what happens? God sends the prophets, right? The Israelites, didn't follow the 10 Commandments. Instead, they just followed their own wants, and they wanted to be like the other nations. They built, they asked for kings, and they had the kings, and they built a monarchy. And even though God is the one that provided everything, the kings would only look after themselves and neglect the poor. And so then God sent the prophets, right? The prophets to call upon the kings and the leaders to say, hey, remember, the role of prophets are not to predict what's going to happen in the future. That's not what a prophet is. A prophet of the Old Testament were those called by God to be the instigators, the ones that remind the leaders, the kings, reminding them of God's call for justice. Our United Methodist Church and Society on Capitol Hill, and I talk about this, right? It's the only non-governmental building in Washington, D.C. The reason why the United Methodist women had that dream of purchasing and establishing that Church and Society building on Capitol Hill was to be the prophetic voice to our nation, to remind our civic leaders of our duty to remember the poor, remember the disenfranchised, remember the marginalized. So the second time that God sent a reminder to the Israelites was when God sent the prophets. And when that didn't work, God, before the Son, remember, it took 3 years and then he still didn't bear fruit. The third was when the Israelites were sent into exile. And you would think that, again, a harsh reality of the temple being torn down and being stripped from their land, their promised land, you would think, it's like, a parent that has to take away the toys and, has to ground the child. It was tough love to take the Israelites out of their promised land into exile so that they would learn that, look, they don't have this special right that, God is only for them and, they can abuse everyone else. It was a lesson that God is the God of all people, not just the Israelites, but the God of Babylon was not some other God, but it was one God. And that through all of that, it was a way to teach the Israelites to turn back to God and not live in ways that abuse and live in selfish ways. And in the beginning, they did that. When Zerubbabel, built that very, very simple temple, it was a way of turning back and keeping it simple. But over time, guess what happens? Humans, right? And God could have said, enough. But the message from this parable is that God says, no, let's give it one more chance. There's always going to be that one more chance. And that one more chance is, but this time, we're not just going to send someone else, right? This time, we're going to pour everything into it. God is going to pour everything of God's self And who does God give? Jesus. That's a parable. And that's day 2 of this week, Monday. We'll continue on with Tuesday next week. Yeah. Thank you for joining me today, and we'll continue next week.